My name is Emily Carter. I am 32, a veteran who bled overseas. Yet the night I came closest to dying was not in uniform, but in my mother's old living room, where my own brother pressed a pistol against my forehead. The barrel was cold and unyielding, the smell of his whiskey-soaked breath mixed with the metal tang of fear in my throat. Mark Carter. My brother towered over me, his eyes glassy with rage, his voice spitting. Sign the pension over to me, or I swear you will not live to see tomorrow. My heart hammered against my ribs, but what pierced deeper than the steel was the sound of Janet, his wife, standing in the corner, whispering with cruel calm, "Just do it, Emily. You are worthless without us. You always were." Her betrayal was a knife turning inside me. My vision blurred, and for one split second the living room dissolved into sand and smoke. My body remembered a battlefield, the ringing of mortars, the taste of blood comrades shouting my name. In war, I had stared down death. I had felt bullets slice the air, and yet never had I felt so utterly alone as in that room with my own blood calling me useless. I gasped. "This pension is mine. I earned it with service you never gave, with scars you never carried." Mark's face twisted darker, his finger tightening on the trigger veins rising like ropes along his hand. The air stilled, time slowed. I swore I could hear the beat of my pulse counting down to nothing. Then the explosion tore through the silence, a gunshot so violent the walls shook. The bullet missed my skull by inches, smashing into the wall behind, ripping plaster into a storm of dust and splinters across my hair and cheek. My ears rang like sirens, my knees buckled. I collapsed to the carpet, gasping, my palms scraping against rough fibers, the taste of copper filling my mouth. Mark sneered. "Next time I will not miss," while Janet muttered, "Do it right and she will finally shut up." Outside, a dog barked wildly. A porch light clicked on footsteps stirred, the neighborhood roused by the gunfire. The shot had not only shattered the wall, it had shattered the silence of the street, and as I lay there trembling with rage and terror, one thought seared into me. My war had not ended abroad. It had begun here in the house of my blood. I was not born into violence, though it seems now that my entire life was carved by it. My name is Emily Carter, and before the night, a gun pressed against my skin. I was a girl who once believed family meant shelter. My earliest memories were wrapped in the smell of engine grease on my father's hands and the soft humming of my mother as she stirred beans on the stove. My father, David Carter, was a mechanic whose back bent under long hours, but whose eyes never lost their kindness. He would lift me high after work, spinning me until my squeals filled the small house. My mother, Linda Carter, was gentle, always telling me that kindness was the only inheritance that mattered, and my older brother Mark, 3 years my senior, was once the boy who chased bullies away from me at school. We shared a narrow bed in winters, whispering plans of the future, and I thought nothing could break the thread between us. But threads snap quickly when tested. When I was 12, my father was crushed under a car lift at the garage, an accident that stole not only his life but the spine of our family. I remember holding my brother's hand at the funeral as rain soaked our black clothes, and I promised we would never let go of each other. I meant it. He did not. My mother shrank into grief, not with screaming, but with silence, her eyes always drifting to a far window as if she had left her body behind. Mark grew hard overnight, sneering at me when I cried, saying, "You are just a kid, you do not know what sacrifice means." Bills piled high on the kitchen table, red ink screaming final notice. I tried babysitting, mowing lawns, anything to help, but I was 12, my coins meaningless against debt. Mark grew restless and angry, calling me a burden even as I scrubbed dishes raw. I still loved him. I thought he was protecting us when he said he would take care of things, that he would be the man of the house, but taking care twisted into controlling. By the time I was 16, he was already slipping into gambling dens, already owing money to men who drove cars with tinted windows. I wanted to escape. When recruiters visited our high school speaking of honor of serving the nation, I felt a spark. I enlisted at 20, desperate to carve a life bigger than these walls of debt and scorn. My mother wept at the station clutching me, but Mark only smirked, saying, "Go ahead, soldier girl. Let us see how long you last." In uniform, I found purpose. Iraq's desert heat seared my lungs. Afghanistan's mountains tested my strength. But I carried out missions. I saved comrades. I survived firefights that left others broken. I earned my Purple Heart not by chance, but by blood, when shrapnel sliced across my shoulder and cheek. In those moments, I thought of my family, thought of sending money home so they could breathe easier. And I did. Month after month, I wired home my pay, enough to keep the house standing. Yet when I came back at 28, scarred but alive, I walked into a house no longer mine. My mother had passed from illness while I was deployed, her last breath taken without me by her side. Mark did not tell me until I landed. His eyes were cold as he said, "She is gone. You were not here. You left me with everything." Guilt crushed me like armor too heavy to carry. I told myself I had failed her, but deep down I knew Mark was twisting the knife. He lived in the house still with his new wife, Janet, a woman whose smile never reached her eyes. The furniture was worn, the walls carried cracks, but what weighed heavier was the shift in power. Mark had not become the protector. He had become the tyrant. He told me, "You went away, now you owe us. This house stayed because of me." He ignored the money I had sent the pension papers I guarded. Janet echoed him, whispering that I should be grateful they let me stay. Every corner of home became hostile ground, each dinner a tribunal of mockery, each conversation a war of words. My service meant nothing to them. When neighbors praised me for serving, Mark cut them off saying, "She thinks she is a hero, but she is just a paycheck in boots." Each insult was heavier than the last because it came not from strangers, but from the boy who once promised to protect me. And yet, I clung to fragments of hope, remembering yellow curtains. My mother once dreamed of curtains that would let sunlight fall gently into this house. I told myself one day I would hang them. But each time I imagined it, Mark's laughter smothered the vision. His debts grew, his desperation sharpened, and his gaze landed on the pension guaranteed for my service. He began to circle it like a predator circling prey. What once was my lifeline, he decided was his entitlement. The backstory of my life is not simply about childhood warmth or loss. It is the descent from brotherly love to brotherly threat, from whispered promises to shouted demands, and from a family home to a battlefield without uniforms. By the time the gun pressed into my skin that night, the journey to that moment had been carved over years, every insult, every theft of kindness, every betrayal laying bricks on the path. Pain did not arrive suddenly in my life. After service, it settled like dust on every surface of the house, coating everything with bitterness until breathing felt heavy. Mark's voice was the first blade each morning, calling me a parasite soldier, telling me that my medals were worthless metal, that my scars were ugly proof of failure. He would sneer while counting overdue bills on the kitchen table, slamming his fist as if each notice was my fault. Janet added her venom with quieter words, leaning against the doorway and saying, "Emily, you should be grateful he even keeps you here." The walls that once echoed with my mother's hymns now carried only insults and accusations. Pain was routine. Some nights Mark would stagger in drunk, shove me against the refrigerator, and hiss, "If you loved this family, you would give me that pension." My cheek burned from his hand, my ribs ached from his fists, but the ache in my chest was heavier when Janet laughed behind him as if my suffering was entertainment. I tried to endure whispering to myself that a soldier survives storms, but inside I felt myself shrinking smaller with every blow. And yet, even in the rhythm of cruelty, sparks of hope dared to rise. I found work at the VA hospital surrounded by others who had served, who looked at me not as a burden, but as someone who understood. When an elderly veteran patted my hand and said, "Thank you for your service," dear, my chest swelled with something Mark could not crush. I saved small amounts of money from each paycheck, tucking the bills into an envelope hidden beneath my mattress. I dreamed of renting a modest apartment, a place where no one called me useless. My coworkers noticed my diligence, one nurse saying, "Emily, you are one of the strongest people here." Hope bloomed fragile, but real. I also found comfort in Sergeant Kelly, an old comrade who lived nearby. Over coffee, he reminded me, "You survived the desert, Emily. You can survive this. Just document everything." His words became a lifeline. I began snapping secret photos of bruises in the mirror, recording Mark's threats on my phone, tucked beneath folded laundry, keeping receipts of medical visits when I could afford them. Each piece was small, but it felt like gathering ammunition for a war I could not yet fight openly. For a brief time, the hope carried me. At night, I wrote in a journal, scribbling fragments of poems, whispering promises to myself that one day I would reclaim the house with yellow curtains glowing. For a while, I believed, but relapse returned with Mark's fury sharper than ever. One evening, he caught me counting the few bills I had hidden. His hand swept across the table, scattering money like scraps, and his voice roared, "You think this will save you, Emily? You think pennies will pay for my debts?" His eyes were bloodshot, his spit hit my cheek, and before I could retreat, his fist crashed into my jaw. I crumpled against the wall, the envelope shredded beneath my knees. Janet stepped forward not to help, but to sneer, "Pathetic, you cannot even keep your own money safe." That night, I lay in bed, tasting blood, my journal hidden beneath the mattress, feeling like a weight of shame rather than hope. Another relapse came when Mark discovered a clipping from the local newspaper that had published an essay I wrote about resilience after war. Holding it had felt like sunlight in my hands, proof that my words mattered, but Mark tore it in half, his laughter slicing me deeper than the paper cuts. "Words do not pay pensions," he snarled. "Words do not feed me." Janet added, "You think you are special, but you are nothing here." My hope crumbled, and I curled on the bed, staring at the crack in the ceiling, wondering if I had been cursed to always be worthless in their eyes. Pain and hope played tug-of-war in my chest, each small victory suffocated by relapse. Some mornings I woke with resolve, dressing in my uniform, even if only for the hospital job, reminding myself of who I was. Other mornings I could not rise heavy with despair, replaying Mark's insults until they felt carved into my bones. The cycle repeated, predictable as tides, yet within it I clung to the fragments of resistance. Even as hope wilted, I forced myself to keep the photos, the recordings, the receipts. They became my secret soldiers, standing silent in a folder hidden behind a loose board in the closet. The rhythm of pain and hope was cruel, but I recognized it. In war, we lost ground and regained it. We bled and healed. We relapsed into fear and rebuilt with courage. I told myself survival was not weakness. Survival was training. But inside the house, the logic twisted. Mark repeated so often that I was useless, that even my pension was not mine, that I began to fear he was right. It was during one of those spirals of despair that he struck me hardest, pinning me against the counter, pressing his forehead against mine, snarling, "If you do not sign it over soon, Emily, I will make sure you disappear." My breath rattled, terror surged, but somewhere deep a spark refused to die. I whispered to myself later in the dark, "I will not disappear. I will not vanish." The pain returned each night. The hope returned each morning. The relapse dragged me down again, but the rhythm itself taught me that endurance was possible. I was not broken, not yet. A soldier learns that strength is not only in the strike, but in patience, in watching and waiting, in gathering the pieces others overlook, and I carried that lesson into my brother's house, where each day felt like a battlefield without uniforms. After every insult, after every slap, I forced myself to think beyond pain, to see each moment as an opportunity to collect evidence, because Mark could break my skin, but I swore he would not erase my truth. The first time I recorded him, I felt my hands trembling as I slipped my phone under a folded shirt on the counter, its tiny light blinking like a hidden ally. His voice filled the kitchen, rough and ugly, shouting, "Your pension belongs to me, Emily. You owe me everything." My heart hammered as the words captured into the device proof carved into digital memory. That night, I played it back alone in my room, the sound of his cruelty confirming what I had long felt, that I was not crazy, that I was not imagining the abuse. I began to take photographs of bruises, careful to tilt the mirror, careful to hide the camera under the hem of my uniform, capturing purple marks across my ribs, the swelling of my lip, the shadow of his fists. Each image I saved onto a hidden folder, renaming them as if they were nothing more than grocery lists. I knew that if he ever found them, he would destroy not only the evidence but me, so I hid an old USB drive behind a loose board in the closet, sliding it into the darkness like burying seeds. Sergeant Kelly's words guided me. Over coffee one morning, he told me, "Emily, you are not just surviving, you are building a case. One day it will matter." His voice steadied me. I began to collect receipts from the VA hospital where nurses documented my injuries in clinical detail. I kept every note, every prescription slip, pressing them flat between pages of my journal. To anyone else, it looked like paper. To me, it was armor. Each insult Mark spat became a weapon I could turn back on him. Each night when I iced my bruises, I whispered, "One day you will answer for this." My resistance was not in shouting back, not in fighting him physically, because that battle I could not win alone. My resistance was in silence, sharpened into strategy. Even when Janet mocked me, calling me pathetic, I smiled faintly, knowing her words were now etched into recordings. Sometimes I imagined standing in court, pressing play, and watching their faces when their own cruelty betrayed them. That vision carried me through despair. The strategy gave me strength, but it was not without fear. Each time Mark stormed through the door, I felt terror that he would search my room, find the folder, smash the USB into dust. My body tensed when he rifled through drawers, my palms sweated when he eyed my phone, but luck, or perhaps discipline, kept me careful. I never confronted him directly. I never boasted of what I had, because secrecy was my shield. At work, I poured myself into caring for veterans, men and women who bore scars deeper than mine. One patient, an old Marine, gripped my hand once and said, "You look tired, but you are brave." His words pierced me with warmth, reminding me that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Bravery now is keeping the evidence safe." The hope of future justice rose inside me like a flame. But even flames flicker under storms. There were nights when despair nearly crushed me flat. Mark would pound on my door, shouting that he knew I was hiding money, that he would tear the pension from my hands with or without papers. Janet would laugh from the hallway, telling him to take the gun if he had to. Their cruelty swirled around me like smoke, but I gritted my teeth and reminded myself, document, survive, endure. Sometimes I replayed the recordings quietly just to hear proof that I was not inventing their hatred. The voices on the tape were weapons heavy but real, and they steadied me. In the silence of my room, I imagined my father's voice, imagined him saying, "Build your foundation, Emily, build it brick by brick." I built mine with files, with photos, with words. The longer I lived in that house, the clearer my strategy became. I would not give Mark the pension. I would not sign papers. I would not bow. I would resist with patience, with planning, with every smart move that turned their cruelty into their downfall. The thought of that future gave me just enough strength to keep breathing. Pain still struck. Relapse still crushed me, but resistance whispered back, "One day, Emily, one day." The night it broke open is seared into me like a scar carved deeper than shrapnel. A storm that began with the slam of a door and the reek of whiskey that clung to my brother's clothes. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder low like a drum, and Mark staggered into the living room with a pistol gleaming in his hand. His eyes were glassy, his grin wide with desperation, and he waved a stack of papers at me as if they were shackles. "You will sign tonight, Emily," he bellowed. "You will give me that pension, or I swear you will never breathe again." My body tensed, every muscle remembering combat drills, but this was no battlefield I had trained for. This was family turned executioner. I stood my ground, clutching the edge of the couch, and whispered, "No, Mark. This pension is mine. It is the only thing I earned that is truly mine. You will not take it." His face twisted into rage veins bulging at his neck, and Janet appeared in the doorway. Her arms crossed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Stop dragging this out, Emily," she spat. "Just sign and save us all the trouble. You are nothing without this family." The betrayal cut sharper than the thunder outside. Mark raised the gun, the barrel aimed straight between my eyes, and in that suspended second, I felt the room dissolve into two worlds colliding. I saw the desert again. The sudden burst of mortar fire, comrades screaming, my heart pounding the same rhythm of survival. I remembered the heat of shrapnel searing my skin, the chaos of war, and yet in that memory there was brotherhood. There was sacrifice. There was meaning. Here in my mother's living room, there was only hatred and greed, the man who shared my blood threatening to erase me. His finger tightened on the trigger and he snarled, "You bled for nothing. Emily now bleed for me." I refused to close my eyes, whispering through clenched teeth, "I will never surrender what is mine." The deafening crack split the night, a gunshot so violent it shook the walls, and the bullet screamed past my head to bury itself in plaster. The wall exploded into shards, dust, and splinters cutting across my cheek, and the smell of gunpowder choked the air. My ears rang, my knees gave way, and I dropped to the carpet, gasping, heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. For a moment, I thought I was dead, that this was the final echo of my life, but breath dragged in ragged and real. Mark laughed above me, the pistol still shaking in his hand, and sneered, "Next time I will not miss." Janet's voice came cold and cruel. "Do it right!" Mark ended her whining. Their words rained down like acid, each syllable burning. I pressed my palms against the floor, trembling rage and terror colliding in my chest. My war was not over. It had begun here. Outside, a dog barked furiously. Neighbors stirred, and I heard the faint slam of a car door. The silence of our street had shattered just as the wall had. My cries slipped from my throat, hoarse and desperate. "Help, please, someone!" Mark's boot crashed against my ribs, rolling me onto my back, and he leaned over me with the gun inches from my face. "Sign the papers or the next bullet goes into you," he roared, spittle flying, his breath hot with whiskey. I could not breathe, I could not move. But somewhere beneath the terror, a soldier's instinct whispered, "Endure, endure." I curled slightly, pretending weakness, letting my body go limp, because survival sometimes means letting the enemy believe they have won. Janet spat on the floor near my head, her eyes glittering with disdain, and hissed, "You have always been a parasite." My vision blurred, but the sound of voices outside grew louder, footsteps pounding closer. Mrs. Johnson's voice slicing through the storm, "I have called the police." My heart surged with a fragile spark. Not safety yet, but possibility. Mark froze for a heartbeat, eyes darting toward the door chest, heaving with panic. Then he dragged me by the arm toward the hallway, muttering, "They will not take me. I will finish this first." My shoulder screamed as I clawed against the floor, splinters biting into my skin, my body battered but alive. I whispered through blood, "No, never." And in that whisper was defiance, a refusal to surrender, even as death loomed. The pounding on the door shook the hinges. Sirens wailed in the distance, and for the first time in years, the power shifted. He could beat me, he could shoot at me, but he could not silence the world beyond these walls. The shot had shattered more than plaster. It had torn open the secrecy of our pain, and as I lay trembling on the carpet, I knew the reckoning had begun. The pounding on the door grew so violent that the frame rattled, and for the first time I saw fear flicker across Mark's face, a thin crack in his drunken rage. He yanked me harder by the arm, trying to drag me down the hallway, but my body went limp and heavy, forcing him to stumble. The pistol wavered in his hand as outside Mrs. Johnson's voice rang out again, trembling yet fierce. "I have called the police." We all heard the gunshot. "Do not think you can hide this." Her words carried the weight of years of silence breaking, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the world might actually be listening. Mark cursed under his breath and shoved me against the wall, pressing the barrel against my cheekbone. "If you ruin me, Emily," he hissed, "I will finish you before they get through that door." His eyes were wild, his hand shaking, but I stared back with defiance, though tears blurred my vision. I whispered, "You cannot erase me, not anymore." The sound of sirens grew louder, blue and red lights flashing through the rain-streaked windows, and the banging at the door reached a final crescendo before the lock gave way. Two officers burst into the room, weapons-drawn voices commanding, "Drop the gun now." For a moment, everything slowed. Mark tightened his grip, his chest heaving, his body caught between fight and surrender. Janet shrieked, "It was an accident. She is unstable. She provoked him." Her words scrambled for control, but her eyes betrayed panic. The officers advanced, their presence solid and unyielding, and I forced my trembling hand toward my pocket. My phone was still recording the small red light blinking, and with what strength I had left, I pressed play. The room filled with Mark's recorded voice dripping with venom. "Your pension is mine or you die." The sound cut through the chaos sharper than any blade. One officer's face hardened, the other shouted again, "Drop the weapon!" Mark's eyes widened, realizing his own words had betrayed him, and in his panic he lunged forward. The officers moved faster, tackling him to the ground, the pistol skidding across the floor. The crash echoed like thunder, and I collapsed onto my side, gasping the weight of years pressing out of me in one long exhale. Even hardened officers faltered at the sight of me battered and bleeding, one muttering under his breath, "My God!" Janet screamed louder, weaving a lie. "She fell. She did this to herself. She always makes things worse." But her voice cracked, the shrill edge revealing desperation. "Mrs." Johnson pushed past the doorway, her umbrella dripping rainwater, her face set in grim fury. I heard every word she said firmly. I saw the way he dragged her. I heard her begging. Her statement hung in the air like a hammer striking truth. Janet paled, her lies crumbling. The officers cuffed Mark, his wrists twisted in cold metal, his curses filling the room. "You think you are safe now, Emily. You will always be weak." His words cut deep, familiar daggers, but for the first time they did not land as wounds. They landed as evidence, words documented not only in my memory, but now witnessed by law. An officer knelt beside me, his tone gentler. "You are safe. Now we have you." That word, safe, cracked something inside me, a flood of sobs tearing loose from my chest. The world tilted, paramedics rushed in, lights flashing, and for the first time in years, I let myself weep openly. They lifted me carefully onto a stretcher. My ribs aching, blood dried against my skin, but through the blur, I saw Mark pinned against the floor, his rage impotent, his power finally slipping away. Janet slumped into a corner, muttering, "This will ruin everything," and I realized with a cold clarity that for her, my destruction had always been more valuable than my survival. As the stretcher carried me into the night air, rain cool against my face, neighbors gathered on porches, their eyes wide with shock. For years they had heard muffled arguments, glimpsed bruises, but tonight the gunshot had forced them to see, to bear witness. Sirens wailed, lights painted the street in streaks of red and blue, and I thought to myself, the silence is broken, the reckoning has begun. Inside the ambulance, the paramedic pressed gauze to my cheek, asking questions, but my mind drifted to the folder hidden behind the closet board, to the USB tucked away, to the evidence I had gathered piece by piece. It was no longer just mine. Now it was supported by witnesses, by police, by neighbors. My war was no longer fought in shadows. It had entered the open where justice could walk. As the ambulance pulled away, I heard Mark still shouting from the squad car, curses thrown like stones, but his wrists were bound and his threats were powerless. I closed my eyes and let exhaustion take me, comforted by the thought that survival had carried me to this night, and now survival would turn into justice. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension, every bench filled with faces both curious and grim, the air heavy with the weight of judgment waiting to fall. I sat at the witness table, my ribs still aching under the fabric of my dress, my lips scarred, my body marked with evidence of months that had nearly destroyed me. Across the room sat Mark Carter, my brother, his hair trimmed neat, a suit, stiff on his shoulders, but his eyes still burning with the same venom that had glared at me across our mother's living room. Janet sat beside him, her hair pulled tight, her hands folded as if neatness could disguise complicity. When the judge entered and the gavel struck, the sound rang like a drumbeat of reckoning. The prosecutor stood tall and steady, unfolding the story brick by brick. He displayed the photographs of bruises, each image projected onto a screen larger than life. The gasp of the gallery rippled as my pain became undeniable, visible to all. He played the recordings, my brother's voice filling the chamber with chilling clarity. "Your pension is mine, or you die." His tone thick with whiskey, each word dripping with malice. The judge's face tightened, the jury shifted, and I felt hope bloom, fragile but real. Mark's attorney rose, smooth-voiced, insisting I was unstable, that years of combat had left me delusional, that my PTSD made me unreliable. He pointed at me, telling the jury I had always been dramatic, prone to exaggeration, that perhaps I had provoked my brother. His words sliced reopening old wounds of doubt, and for a heartbeat I shrank, remembering all the times I had asked myself if maybe I was weak. Then Mrs. Johnson stepped to the stand, her voice clear, unwavering. I heard the gunshot. I saw him drag her. I heard her begging. She looked directly at me and said, "She was not weak. She was surviving." Tears burned in my eyes, my chest rising with a strength that his lawyer's barbs could not erase. Janet was called next, her mask cracking under pressure. She tried to spin lies, claiming I had always been reckless, that I had taunted Mark, that the gun went off by mistake. But her voice wavered, her words collapsing when the prosecutor asked why she told Mark to do it right. The courtroom froze, her face drained of color, and I felt the tide shifting. The officers who had entered that night gave their testimony, one saying, "In 20 years, I have never seen such brutality inside a family home." Their authority wrapped around me like a shield, their words lifting the burden I had carried alone. Still, the trial was not a straight climb to justice. There were moments I thought I would crumble when Mark glared at me from across the room, mouthing silently, "You will pay the same look he had given me on nights he pinned me against walls." Fear slithered, cold relapse of the terror that had haunted me. But then the prosecutor pressed play on one final recording. My brother's drunken voice shouting, "If you do not sign Emily, I will put you in the ground." Gasps echoed, the judge's gavel struck to silence the uproar, and in that moment the walls of denial fell. My scars were no longer invisible, my words no longer dismissed. The jury deliberated hours, stretching like years, and I sat trembling, my hands clasped tight, wondering if all my evidence would be enough. When the foreman rose and spoke guilty on charges of assault with a deadly weapon, guilty on attempted extortion, guilty on coercion, the air seemed to break open. Mark shouted curses as officers moved to restrain him, his face twisted in rage, his power finally shackled in cold steel. Janet paled as the court declared she forfeited her claim to the family home due to complicity. Her head bowed as whispers swirled through the gallery. For years they had controlled me, gaslit me, convinced me I was nothing. But now their downfall was public, undeniable. The judge's sentence fell heavy, 15 years in prison, his words final and firm. Justice demands accountability. The gavel struck again, sealing the fate that had once seemed impossible. My chest shook with sobs, not of despair, but of release, a flood of years breaking free. I looked around the courtroom and saw neighbors, veterans, even strangers nodding, their eyes filled with something I had not felt in so long, belief. When I stepped down from the stand, my knees wobbled, but an officer steadied me, murmuring, "You did well." Those 3 words stitched strength back into me. Outside, reporters called my name, microphones reaching like grasping hands, but I said only this: I survived. That sentence tasted like victory, simple and whole. Inside me, I knew the war had left scars that no verdict could erase, but I also knew that the truth had prevailed. My father's house, once a cage, was now legally mine. The pension safe, my dignity intact. Justice had not healed everything, but it had carved the names of my abusers into shame where they belonged. When the trial ended and the gavel struck for the last time, I stepped out of the courthouse into daylight that felt different than any I had known before, sharp and clean, as if the air itself had been cleared of smoke. Mark was gone into the prison system, Janet stripped of her grip on the house, but the weight of years still clung to my shoulders. Healing does not arrive like a single sunrise. It comes in fragments, and mine began the day I walked back into my parents' old house, carrying the keys now in my name. The rooms still echoed with ghosts, the kitchen tiles where I had fallen the wall that still carried the scar of the bullet hole. But instead of collapsing in fear, I touched that wall and whispered, "You did not kill me." I opened the windows wide, letting air rush through halls that had suffocated under secrets, and for the first time, the house did not feel like a cage, but like a place I might reclaim. I spent days cleaning, scrubbing the stains of rage from the counters, painting over cracks, replacing broken plates with ones I chose myself. Friends from the VA hospital came to help carrying laughter into rooms that had known only shouts. Sergeant Kelly brought paintbrushes and said, "This is your mission now, Emily, rebuild." We worked until our arms ached, until the walls gleamed with new color. And when I finally hung yellow curtains across the windows, I felt a promise fulfilled the same curtains my sister and I once dreamed of as children. Hanging them was bittersweet, a reminder of love lost, but also proof that survival could blossom into something tangible. I placed my Purple Heart medal in a frame on the mantel beside a folded flag, not as trophies, but as symbols that my suffering had meaning, that I had carried sacrifice and lived to tell it. Neighbors began to visit, not with pity, but with respect, Mrs. Johnson especially, who carried flowers and said, "I knew you were strong, Emily, now everyone does." Her presence anchored me. The house filled with voices not of cruelty, but of kindness. I began hosting small gatherings of veterans women like me who had faced battles both abroad and at home. We sat in the living room once drenched with my blood and now lit with sunlight, sharing stories, each voice weaving into a net of resilience. One woman told me my words kept her alive on a night she wanted to give up, and hearing that I felt a power greater than any verdict. The community grew. I used part of the settlement to start a small writing workshop at the community center, offering survivors a space to write their truths. The first night, only 2 people came, their eyes hollow with fear. But when I told them words can be lanterns in the dark, they leaned in and listened. That moment healed me more than any bandage. Pain still visited, of course. Some nights I woke sweating from nightmares, hearing gunfire, hearing Mark's voice hissing parasite. I would lie trembling, staring at the curtains swaying in moonlight, and remind myself I was not there anymore, that he was locked away, that the power he once held was gone. Relapse came in those shadows, but rebuild followed with each dawn when sunlight touched the yellow fabric, when friends called, when I wrote in my journal and saw my words as proof of survival. My mother passed years before, but sometimes I imagined her humming again, imagined her voice saying, "You are not weak. Emily, you carried us further than we ever dreamed." I chose to believe she would have been proud. The scars on my body remained, the ache in my ribs flared when the weather changed, but I wore them openly, refusing to hide what had been done to me. When strangers asked, I said simply, "I survived." The house that once trapped me became a place of gathering laughter, returning like long-lost music. Healing was not perfect, but it was real. I realized that justice in the courtroom had been necessary, but justice in my heart was slower found in forgiveness of myself for staying too long in learning that survival was not weakness, but strength refined in fire. And when I walked through the rooms, now painted sunlight falling soft across the yellow curtains, I knew I had not just survived, I had rebuilt. When I look back now at the night my brother pressed a gun against my skin and the bullet shattered the silence, I no longer see only the terror. I see the entire journey that followed a rhythm of pain and hope and relapse and rebuild that shaped me into someone I never imagined I could be. Pain was the first teacher. It taught me how fragile family could be, how blood could turn into a chain around your throat, how words spoken by those you love can cut deeper than any blade. Hope came quietly in the voices of neighbors, in the touch of friends, in the knowledge that my scars did not make me worthless but proved I had endured. Relapse came with nightmares, with echoes of Mark's voice telling me I was nothing, with shadows that dragged me back to the floor of that living room. But each relapse was followed by rebuild, by moments where I chose to rise again, to hang the yellow curtains, to open the door of my house, to others who carried wounds like mine. Justice in the courtroom was powerful. It gave me back my house, my pension, my dignity. But the deeper justice was learning to forgive myself for the years I doubted, for the times I believed their lies, for the nights I thought survival was weakness. Healing meant understanding that survival itself is strength, that endurance is not cowardice, but courage carried in silence until the moment it can finally speak. I stand in the house my father built, sunlight falling through curtains. My sister and I once dreamed of a purple heart framed on the mantel, a flag folded in memory of all I gave and all I lost. Mark sits behind bars, Janet gone from my life, and though sorrow still lingers for what family should have been, I no longer let it chain me. Instead, I choose to build a new family of voices and hands that lift rather than strike. I speak now to those who hear me, to anyone living inside pain, anyone told they are nothing, anyone gaslit into believing their scars make them weak. You are more than their cruelty. Document your truth. Reach out, find allies who will not look away. I once believed no one would ever stand with me, but I was wrong. Strangers became my shield, neighbors became my witnesses. Justice came because I refused to be silent. If you carry bruises hidden, if you hear insults whispered until you doubt yourself, know this: you are not alone, your story matters, and survival is possible. I survived not by surrendering, but by resisting smartly, by gathering proof, by holding on to the whisper that one day the truth would be heard. That day came for me, and it can come for you. If my story moves, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let them know that silence can be broken, that even when betrayal comes from blood, justice can still rise. Together, we can turn stories of pain into lanterns of hope. Together, we can prove that no cruelty lasts forever when courage endures. My war did not end abroad. It began in my own house, but it did not end there either. It ended with me alive, standing and speaking, and that is a victory no one can take away.